On March 13, 1962, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military submitted a document to the Secretary of Defense. The document proposed a series of operations to create a pretext for war with Cuba. Among its specific proposals, sink an American Navy ship and blame Cuba. Shoot down a drone aircraft disguised as a civilian airliner and claim Cuba had killed American passengers. Stage real terrorist attacks in Miami and Washington and frame the Cuban government. In the document's own language, develop a communist Cuba terror campaign in Miami, other Florida cities, and even in Washington. Create casualty lists in U.S. newspapers to generate public outrage. The document was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and approved by all four service chiefs. President Kennedy rejected it. The document was classified for 35 years. When it was finally declassified, it proved that the people whose job was to defend the United States had formally proposed murdering American citizens to start a war. To understand Operation Northwoods, you have to understand April 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA operation using Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the United States to overthrow Fidel Castro, had failed catastrophically. The invasion force was captured within 72 hours. Kennedy had refused to provide the U.S. air cover that military planners had considered essential. The Joint Chiefs were furious. The CIA was humiliated. Castro, having survived an American-backed invasion, became internationally celebrated as a leader who had stood up to the United States. The Soviet Union, watching the failure, drew conclusions about American resolve. Within months, the Soviets would begin the process that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In this environment, the military's desire to find a pretext for direct U.S. intervention in Cuba was intense, and the question of how to manufacture such a pretext became a formal planning exercise within the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs Organization. The document that became known as Operation Northwoods was formally titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba and was submitted to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. It was 15 pages long, classified top secret, and signed not by a rogue officer but by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and countersigned by representatives of all four military services. Its premise was straightforward. The United States needed to create a justification for the use of U.S. military force in Cuba. Its proposals were organized around the concept of manufacturing incidents that would, in the document's own language, create a favorable world opinion for American military action. The document explicitly discussed casualty lists, American deaths, as a tool for building domestic and international support. It proposed incidents to establish a credible attack using genuine violence as well as staged simulations. The document was not a theoretical exercise. It was a formal policy recommendation, processed through normal military channels, that required only the Secretary of Defense's approval to become operational. The proposals in Operation Northwoods are worth examining in their precise language because that language was written by senior military officers and approved by the highest uniformed leadership of the United States. The document proposed to blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba, specifically referencing the USS Maine, the ship whose suspicious destruction in Havana Harbor in 1898 had provided the pretext for the Spanish-American War. It proposed to develop a communist Cuba terror campaign in Miami, other Florida cities, and even in Washington using real or simulated attacks. It proposed to create a fake Cuban Air Force, using American aircraft painted with Cuban markings, to attack a drone aircraft while a civilian airliner was in the area, then claim Cuba had shot down an American passenger jet. It proposed to foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, staging attacks on Cuban exile communities and blaming Castro. Each proposal came with implementation guidance. Each had been reviewed and approved before reaching McNamara's desk. McNamara showed the document to President Kennedy. By multiple accounts of the meeting, Kennedy's reaction was one of visceral rejection. He said nothing positive about any proposal in the document. Within days, he met privately with General Lemnitzer and made clear that military intervention in Cuba was not being considered. 1 month later, Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs and reassigned as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a prestigious title that moved him from Washington to Europe and away from the center of American military planning. Kennedy never publicly disclosed the existence of Northwoods. The rejection was communicated through reassignment rather than confrontation. The document was classified. The Joint Chiefs who had signed it remained in their positions. The institutional culture that had produced the proposal, that had processed, reviewed, and unanimously approved a plan to murder American citizens, continued to function without any formal reckoning with what had been proposed. Operation Northwoods remained classified for 35 years. It was discovered not by a congressional investigation or a whistleblower but by a researcher. James Bamford, working on a book about the National Security Agency, encountered the document in 2001 while reviewing materials released under the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, a 1992 law requiring the declassification of documents related to the Kennedy assassination. Northwoods was included in that release because it fell within the relevant timeframe and bureaucratic scope. Bamford published the document's contents in his 2001 book Body of Secrets. The revelation received significant media coverage, was quickly confirmed as authentic, and then largely receded from public consciousness within weeks. No congressional hearing was held to examine it. No official statement was issued. The document that proved the Joint Chiefs of Staff had formally proposed murdering American civilians to start a war was released, acknowledged, and absorbed into the background noise of American history without consequence. 2 years after Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods, a different set of events in the Gulf of Tonkin provided the pretext for American military escalation in Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was genuinely attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, an attack that did occur. On August 4, a second attack was reported. President Johnson used the second attack to obtain the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, authorization for military force in Vietnam that effectively began the Vietnam War. The second attack almost certainly did not happen. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the same man who had received Operation Northwoods, later acknowledged that the August 4 incident probably didn't happen. NSA documents declassified in 2005 confirmed that signals intelligence used to justify the second attack had been misinterpreted or manipulated. Northwoods does not prove the Gulf of Tonkin was staged. It proves that the institutional capacity, the planning methodology, and the willingness to manufacture pretexts for war had been formally approved at the highest level of American military planning 2 years earlier. Operation Northwoods fits within a documented historical pattern of what intelligence analysts call false flag operations, incidents manufactured or misattributed to create political justification for actions that would otherwise lack public support. The pattern does not require conspiracy. It requires only that institutions under pressure to achieve a goal, facing a legitimacy gap between what they want to do and what they can justify publicly, develop operational plans to close that gap through the manufacture of justification. The Gleiwitz incident of 1939, Nazi SS officers dressed in Polish uniforms attacking a German radio station to justify the invasion of Poland, is the most documented example. The USS Maine in 1898 remains disputed. The Lavon Affair of 1954, in which Israeli intelligence operatives planted bombs in Egyptian targets to blame Egyptian nationalists and influence American policy, is confirmed. Northwoods sits within this pattern as the only fully documented, signed, approved by the highest uniformed command proposal to manufacture a pretext using American civilian deaths. The version of Operation Northwoods available in the public record is not complete. Several sections of the document remain redacted, blacked out even in the 2001 declassification. The available document is 15 pages. The full document, based on page numbering visible in the declassified version, contained additional pages that have never been released. What those pages contain is unknown. Other documents from the same period and planning process, related documents that were processed through the same channels, reviewed by the same offices, and addressed similar subject matter, remain classified. The declassification that revealed Northwoods was partial and incidental, produced by a law about Kennedy assassination records rather than by a deliberate decision to disclose military planning documents from the Kennedy era. What was released represents what fell within the statute's scope. What remains classified represents the decisions of agencies that have never been asked publicly to explain the withheld content. The most important thing about Operation Northwoods is not that Kennedy rejected it. It is that it was submitted. The document was not a rogue idea from a single disturbed officer. It was reviewed through multiple layers of the military chain of command, refined through multiple drafts, and submitted with the unanimous approval of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a formal policy recommendation. The people who signed it were not unusual or extreme within their institution. They were the institution. General Lemnitzer was a decorated veteran of World War II in Korea, considered among the most distinguished military officers of his generation. The system produced the document not despite working correctly but because it was working correctly, processing the operational problem it had been given, which was how to justify military action against Cuba, and producing the solution its analysis indicated was most likely to work. The system that generated Northwoods was not replaced or reformed after Kennedy's rejection. It was continued. Operation Northwoods forces a question that democratic institutions are not designed to answer comfortably. If the highest military command of the United States formally proposed to murder its own citizens to start a war, and this proposal was rejected not through institutional accountability but through a single president's personal decision, what prevents a future iteration of the same proposal from being accepted by a different president in a different moment of pressure? The document was classified, not condemned. The officers who approved it were reassigned, not disciplined. The planning process that generated it was not examined or reformed. The institutional culture that made the proposal seem reasonable and appropriate to the people who made it was left intact. 35 years later, when the document was released, it received 2 weeks of media coverage and was forgotten. The answer to the question may be that there is no institutional answer, that the only barrier between a formal proposal to commit mass murder as government policy and its implementation was, in 1962, one president who said no. The document exists. It is in the National Archives. It is signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and approved by all 4 service chiefs. It proposes murdering American citizens to start a war. It was rejected by one president. The officers who approved it were not disciplined. The planning process that produced it was not reformed. It was classified for 35 years. When it was released, the news cycle moved on in 2 weeks. Subscribe to Operation Redact. The documents that change everything are almost always the ones that don't stay in the headlines.